We're reading Matthew chapter 23, and I'm going to begin at verse 13 and read to the end of the chapter, and then Eddie will preach on this passage for us. Matthew chapter 23 and verse 13. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools! Which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gift of the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? For anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides! You strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside, you're full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead then and complete what your ancestors started. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore I am saying you prophets and sages and teachers, some of them you will kill and crucify, others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town, and so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come upon this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Eddie, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Paul. Can you hear me? Is it still working? Okay, let's go. It's a strange passage, the one we've just read. It's all of these woes, woe, 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 woe. And it's hard to know what to make of it. But I think it is really important that we see it in the whole context of Matthew's gospel, because Matthew is doing something quite important with this passage. Here, right getting near the end, we see 7 woes. Near the beginning of the gospel, at the start of Jesus' public ministry, in Matthew chapter 5, you see 7 blessings. And Matthew is putting them in such a way that those two sort of 7 blessings, 7 woes contrast with each other. And if you have time, it's really worth reading the 7 blessings, the 7 beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5 with these 7 woes and seeing how they bounce off each other. We don't have time to do that now, but I'd recommend it's something you think about. But there's something else going on, and this is the very last time that Jesus addresses the scribes, the teachers of the law, and the Pharisees. This is the last time he meets with them. And he builds up through these 7 woes to an absolutely devastating climax. I've called it Endgame. It's one for those who like the Marvel films. But Jesus builds this last encounter with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law up into an absolutely devastating climax. So what I'd like to do, just to find our way through it, and it's a long passage, we can't go into fine detail and everything, but I'd like to look at 3 headings. First of all, just briefly, who are the Pharisees and the teachers of the law? Because we need to understand a bit about them to know why Matthew is putting this incident in such an important place. But then look at what Jesus is accusing them of. And then finally, what does it all mean? The so what question. So let's go through one at a time. First of all, who are the Pharisees and the teachers of the law? Now, Paul gave us some background on this last week, but I think we just need to dig a little bit deeper than that. If you've read through the Old Testament, you'll know that there is a repeating story. The Jewish people drift away from God, they disobey him, they fail to keep their laws. God sends them prophets, they often just turn their backs on the prophets, and again and again, God is forced to judge his people, to send calamity upon them, exile, because they have refused to follow him. Now, we know that through reading the Old Testament. But the thing is, the Jews of Jesus' time knew it too. They saw this repeated pattern, and they saw that they were now living not in exile, but they were under the yoke of the Roman Empire. They were oppressed, and they saw that as being part of God's judgment. 200 years earlier, they'd been oppressed by the Greeks, and they saw that things were continually going wrong. And a number of reform groups sprung up who were determined to keep God's law so that judgment would no longer come upon them. And among these reform groups were the teachers of the law, or the scribes in different translations, and the Pharisees. Basically, these were groups who aimed to keep God's law as well as possible so that the country wouldn't fall under the judgment that it had fallen under in the past. Now, our problem is that we look at the Pharisees and the teachers of the law with the hindsight of Jesus' teaching. We see how Jesus has exposed their hypocrisy. But at the time, they seemed to be the people that we'd been waiting through the whole Old Testament to see. All through the Old Testament, we're waiting for a group of God's people who would keep the law. And that's what we've got here with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. They were the good guys. And when Jesus attacks them, it's truly shocking. We've got the pinnacle of Judaism, what we've finally been waiting for, or so it seems. And here is Jesus tearing a strip off them. So what exactly does Jesus say? We've got 7 woes, and they are actually built on the pattern of the denunciation of hypocrisy that Paul opened up to us last week. And the woes come in 3 pairs. That makes 6. And then the last one, which draws everything together and highlights what Matthew is getting at in this passage. Now, we don't have time to go in fine detail, but let's get into them. The first theme, perhaps, is they don't practice what they preach. They don't practice what they preach. Look back at verse 3 from last week. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. And then into today's passage, verses 13 to 15. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves don't enter, nor will you let those who enter who are trying to. Woe to you, teachers of law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you've succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. The Pharisees, teachers of the law, they claimed to be the ones who were drawing in God's blessing, the ones who were doing it right. But they were shutting the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, says Jesus. So what is the door to the kingdom of heaven? It's Jesus himself. Jesus was the one, the Messiah, the anointed one of God, who came to open up the pathway to a relationship with God. And the Jewish leaders constantly stood against him. They said they were the way, but when the way came, they turned people away from him. Not only that, they traveled around the world making disciples for themselves who were also hostile to Jesus. And it's interesting to note as you read on in the New Testament, even in the church age, that continued. Because you got people coming from Jerusalem to churches, new churches that had been planted by Paul and others, telling people that they still had to keep the Jewish law in the way the Pharisees and the teachers of the law wanted. Faith in Jesus wasn't enough. You had to keep the law. You had to keep the Pharisees happy. And you see that in the book of Acts and in Galatians in particular, where Paul is having to struggle with the descendants of these Pharisees who are still going around preaching their view of how things should be. The second pair of woes, they make life difficult for others. And again, going back to passage from last week, they tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Woe to you, blind guides! You say if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by a gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, if anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it, and anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and the one who dwells in it, and anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and the one who sits on it. Woe to you, you teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have preached the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides! You strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Now, earlier on in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus has told people not to swear oaths anyway. He says, just let your yes be yes, your no be no. You don't need to swear oaths. But he doesn't sort of go into that now. He just wants to look at the stupidity of the way that people are teaching. And if you want to swear an oath, as a Jew, what guidance do you get from the Pharisees? Well, swearing by the altar doesn't mean anything, but swear by the gift on the altar does mean something. Swearing by the temple, it's just confusing. The temple isn't an oath sworn by the temple means nothing, but if you swear by the gold in the temple, it means something. It's just confusing. People don't know where to go. And what Jesus says basically is, look, whoever you swear by, it always includes something bigger. And in the end, if you swear by anything, you are swearing by God, the one who sits on the throne, which is why earlier on he said, don't swear oaths. You've got this just really complex system that the Pharisees and teachers of the law have invented, And Jesus says, well, actually, any oath is sworn by God. So why bother? And then you've got this thing, give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin. How do you do that? You've got your garden herbs. You've got to go through and count out the leaves. They're just making life really difficult for people. And yet they're ignoring the important things: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. They're making this huge burden of having to count out all the seeds in your garden and divide them into tens, and they're ignoring the important things. And Jesus just says, look, you're blind. You're straining out a gnat and you're swallowing a camel. Now, in the original, the words gnat and camel are camela and gamela. Very close. Jesus is making a play on words here. It's as if he said, you're straining out an ant and you're swallowing an elephant. And you can just imagine as he's doing that, he's acting it out. You're straining out an ant and you are swallowing an elephant. And everybody is laughing, apart from the scribes and Pharisees. He is starting to get under their skin. He's using a joke to make things very, very strong. And then the third pair of woes, they are dirty on the inside. Everything that they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries, Paul talked about them, wide and tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplace and to be called rabbi by others. It's from last week. This week, verse 25. Woe to you, teachers of law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they're full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee. First clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will also be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law, you hypocrites. You're like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you're full of hypocrisy and wickedness. The point is easy. You're like a cup that's clean on the outside, dirty on the inside. You're like tombs, beautiful decorative tombs, but inside there's an output of bones and unpleasant stuff. Jesus is just making a very clear point of the hypocrisy of these Pharisees, underlining in graphic detail what he already said in the passage we looked at last week. But again, there's just a little thing to notice in verse 26. Up till now, he's been talking to the Pharisees in general. And now he says, blind Pharisee. He's speaking to one of them. Now, whether he's just using that as dramatic, or perhaps there was a Pharisee standing there with a cup, and Jesus just turns to him and points to him. Blind Pharisee. He is ratcheting up the rhetoric here. Jesus is getting more intense as he's speaking. And that really develops in the last of the woes, the Endgame. And this is where the rubber really hits the road. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we'd lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore, I'm sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify, others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly, I tell you, all this will come on this generation. Jesus has compared the Pharisees to whitewashed graves, beautiful on the outside, dirty on the inside. And he carries on that theme and thinks about the graves of the prophets. The Pharisees and teachers love to create graves and memorials for the Old Testament prophets, all of whom were killed persecuted during their lives. And they claimed that, well, if we'd been alive, we wouldn't have killed them. Now, Jesus' answer doesn't seem quite logical to our way of thinking, but it made perfect sense in the time. He says, because they are the descendants of the ones who killed the prophets, they're going to go and do the very same thing. And he challenges them to finish what their forefathers start. And we know that within a few days, he'll do that. They will do that. They will kill prophets again, because within a very few days, these people who claimed that they would not have persecuted the Old Testament prophets will be calling for Jesus to be sacrificed, to be crucified. Jesus said, "You're just the same as they were." And they proved it. And then in verse 33, Jesus takes a step further. He picks up on the words of John the Baptist. He calls the Pharisees teachers and snakes who are in danger of hell. Remember, these are the great hope of Judaism. These are the ones who are supposed to be obeying the law and making everything right. And Jesus says they're in danger of hell. And he promises that he'll send them more teachers to denounce them, to speak against them. And that those earlier prophets and those teachers that he sends will also be condemned by the Pharisees. And again, within a very short time, we see that the Pharisees and teachers of the law would step up and murder Stephen. We read about that in Acts 6, and cause most of Jesus' followers to flee from Jerusalem. A prominent Pharisee called Saul would get the authority to kill Jesus' followers wherever he found them. The scribes and teachers would be guilty of the death of all of the righteous people, from Abel in the early chapters of Genesis to the prophet Zechariah, who was the last martyr in the Hebrew Bible. Jesus said, you are people who have murdered the prophets, and you're going to keep on doing it. And the guilt of all of that is on your heads. Now stop and pause for a moment. The Pharisees and teachers of the law saw themselves as a reform movement. They were better than other Jews. They were the great hope, the ones that wouldn't make the mistakes of the past. But here in his last encounter with them, Jesus declares forcefully they are just the same as the previous generations. The previous generations rejected God and his laws, and for all their supposed obedience, the Pharisees and teachers were facing God's judgment. They'd not learned the simple lesson that Abraham had learned. You're righteous in God's eyes by your faith, not by your actions. The great reformers of Judaism had failed dismally. The Romans had taken over their land, and as we'll see when we get into Matthew 24, the temple will be destroyed. Apparently, there's just no hope. So, what does all this mean? The first thing is to note is that it reminds us that you can't please God by your actions alone. If you just try and pleasing God by doing stuff, you will lose sight of God, and you'll end up focusing on yourself. You'll end up focusing on trying to look good and what people think about you. And for all of their learning, the Pharisees and teachers of the law missed this simple point. But perhaps more importantly, we need to remember that Jesus was addressing religious people who took the Bible very seriously, people like us. As Christians, we have to be aware of the danger of hypocrisy in our own lives. It's no use us condemning the rest of the world for failing moral standards if we don't live up to Jesus' standards ourselves. Do we put barriers in the way of people who want to know more about Jesus? What about the minutiae of our choices? Do we get hung up on little things? Do we get hung up on looking good and ignore the big ones? Are we quick to condemn others for their views on something like the pandemic, while we forget our primary responsibility is to love, care, and pray for them? Are our outsides all nice and clean, but the insides less so? Are we all shiny and impressive at church or on Zoom, but our first reaction is to go home and tear people to shreds? Do we impress people at church by our singing and our fervour? But we'd really rather that people didn't know about the way we treat our families or what's in our internet history. Matthew is at pains to demonstrate the importance of this episode in his gospel. And the final clash between Jesus and the Jewish reform movement is epic. But we can't afford to sit back and think that it doesn't concern us. Let's draw it to a close. The last few verses. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I've longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, the house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you won't see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. There was no hope for the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. Their house was desolate. They were just carrying on like their ancestors. But Jesus' desire wasn't to condemn them. Yes, he says they are guilty. Yes, they will face judgment. But what did he want to do? He wanted to gather them up like a hen gathers her chicks. But they were not willing. And because they were not willing, it was hopeless. Or was it? Remember, I mentioned a Pharisee called Saul, who had permission to kill Jesus' followers. He was on his way to we saw this in the video. He was on his way to persecute a group of Christians in Damascus. And there he met the risen Jesus. Saul realized that trying to serve God by his actions alone had led him completely astray, and meeting Jesus face to face changed him. He put his faith in Jesus, changed his name to Paul, and became one of the most remarkable Christians in all of history. In context, this is a devastating passage. The last hope of Judaism is snuffed out as Jesus reveals their hypocrisy and their lack of faith. Equally, for anyone who consider themselves religious and is willing to look deep inside themselves, it isn't comfortable reading. But the answer is the same. Welcome Jesus. He said, you will not see me till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. If we want to see Jesus, we have to welcome him just the way that the Apostle Paul did. And say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The Pharisees found their hope in their actions, and it all fell apart. Saul eventually found his hope in Jesus, and everything came together. And the call is still the same for us. Where is our hope? Let's pray. Lord, these words are hard. They're not easy to read. They're not easy to take on board. But thank you that, like the evil Pharisee Saul, who turned his back on you and persecuted your followers, there is hope for us in meeting with Jesus and in turning to him. Help us, Lord, to continually do that. Amen.